Right. This is it's a slightly intimidating video to make this one because there's just so much that I want to fit into this. I'll be honest, I've been thinking about the structure of this video now for a day and a half, and I'm still not quite sure how it's all going to hang together. I'm kind of pleased in a way that I've got my 4 pledge videos out for the month. So if this all turns into mush somewhere along the lines, well, then, at least nobody's giving me any money for this specific video. Why am I making this video? It's a video I'm making about Jordan Peterson, gender pronouns, and the whole Canadian Bill C-16 thing. And I'm doing it primarily because I've been asked to quite a number of times now on Facebook, publicly and privately, and on YouTube, publicly and privately in private messages. So over the last few days, I've had a look at the Canadian Human Rights Act briefly, had a look at Bill C-16, which is an amendment to the Canadian Human Rights Act, had a listen to Jordan Peterson. There was a tremendous debate, I'm very pleased that they decided to do this. The University of Toronto decided to host a debate between Jordan Peterson and some other people, such as Professor Brenda Crossman, speaking for the opposite side of that, and to try and get my head around the issues that are involved. The issues are complicated, which makes the structure of this video somewhat complicated. The other thing that makes this video somewhat complicated is that I've spent a day and a half trying to figure it out, and whenever I'm rehearsing this little video with myself, every time that I want to say Jordan Peterson, I keep saying Jordan Henderson, right? So I want to make it clear from the get-go that if any time hence in this video I use the name Jordan Henderson, I'm actually meaning to refer to Professor Jordan Peterson, who's a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and not literally to Jordan Henderson, who's a central midfielder who plays for Liverpool Football Club. And as much as I don't want to make that mistake and getting these two confused, I hope Jurgen Klopp doesn't make the same mistake, and next time Liverpool take the field that Jordan Peterson strolls out there, because as a bad job as Jordan Henderson sometimes does, I'm sure he's going to do a better job than Jordan Peterson in that regard. So look, this is going to be quite a difficult video. I want to cover a number of things. I want to talk fundamentally about Bill C-16 and whether the claims that Jordan Peterson makes are reasonable there. I want to talk about Jordan Peterson's more general claims because he draws it into a more general context. He also talks about various other things. He talks about, as they're all talking about the Toronto Human Rights Act. They're also talking about, the Ontario Human Rights Act. They're also talking about the University of Toronto's understanding and interpretation of the Ontario Human Rights Act. So these are all different things that need to be taken on board. And Jordan Peterson also talks about these tribunals that you have in Ontario and draws a distinction between courts of law and tribunals. And of course he's right, they are very different things. Social justice tribunals, as they call them in Ontario, and I think he's right to see something slightly Orwellian in that name, I'll say right from the outset. And for those who take umbrage with me saying that and say, what could possibly be wrong about a social justice tribunal? I've got to say, from an Orwellian perspective, I could throw back what could possibly be wrong with a Ministry of Truth. If we take a naive look at these terms, what could possibly be wrong with a ministry that's just an objective and dispassionate search for the truth? But we understand that in actual fact these things mean rather more. And of course, what would be wrong with a tribunal that tried to take a sort of dispassionate dispensation of justice in the social sphere? But that isn't what we mean. We mean something rather more political when we talk about social justice. So perhaps to frame your tribunal by calling it a social justice tribunal kind of gives the game away, doesn't it? It doesn't suggest a great deal of neutrality in terms of its perspective there. So I understand some of those things. But the first thing that we need to consider then is this whole business of Jordan Peterson and gender pronouns, because he is making the claim, a very distinct claim here, that under this legislation of Bill C-16, that the Canadian government is effectively mandating him to use certain terms, right? That it's forcing his hand. And he draws a distinction between other things such as racism and then things like that, where certain terms are maybe proscribed, right? There are certain terms which you're not allowed to use because they could be regarded as racist, but nobody is prescribing terms. And what he draws is a distinction here, as he says, in this term, effectively, we are prescribing terms. We are saying that you have to use the gender pronouns that somebody wants you to use, and if you don't use that, you're going to fall foul of that. So I had a look at Bill C-16, and I'll show you it now, and I tried to set that in the context of the Canadian Human Rights Act. And what Bill C-16 effectively does is it takes these parts of protected, I don't know actually, right, it takes these parts of protected characteristics, or at least that's what we call them in the United Kingdom, and it adds on, it bolts on this other characteristic. So we have these protected characteristics of race, national or ethnic origin, colour, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, disability or conviction for an offence for which a pardon has been granted, and tacks on to that whole slew of things, gender, identity, or expression. Now, the first thing that sprung out for me with regard to this, without even looking at the particular demands of the bill and of the Canadian Human Rights Act, is that in none of these other spheres that are listed here does anybody ever make the claim that specific language is being prescribed, right? So we might say that you can't start, if you call somebody a nigger, that's racist and you could fall foul of the act. But nobody is suggesting that somebody can start demanding what words you use, that somebody could say, I demand you call me a person of colour and not South Asian or not black or what have you, okay, or vice versa, demand that you don't call them a person of colour but you call them black. That somebody who is mixed race, and I know a lot of mixed race people for whatever reason decide to call themselves black, that no mixed race person could demand that you call them black rather than mixed race, or demand that you call them mixed race rather than black. None of these arguments have ever sprung to the fore, and yet this business of gender identity and expression in terms of the legislation of Bill C-16 is simply being set aside all the other things, and it gives no indication that there is anything specific or untoward with regard to gender identity and expression, and any implication that certain types of language is going to be prescribed where it isn't in these other scenarios, right? So I felt as a result of that, and also listening to the debate that had been hosted at the University of Toronto, that Jordan Peterson had overplayed his hand slightly with regard to this, that the claim that he's making didn't really hold very much water. And what was telling is, whereas his opponent, Brenda Crossman, spent a great deal of time detailing why she thinks he's wrong with regard to this, in his initial 10 minutes, he didn't really talk about this at all, right? That was his chance to talk about this, and he didn't really provide a defence. He did later on in his talk, in the bits that he talked about, and he'd invite everybody to go and have a listen to the whole debate, because it's fascinating, and you realise just how many different layers of complexity all of this debate has. He did mention the pronouns on a number of occasions, but in terms of Bill C-16, he never really got to grips with why he was making the claim that it's being very prescriptive and demanding that he uses certain pronouns and not others. So what I'm going to do with regard to that, the first thing that I'm going to do before I start playing you some clips of Jordan Peterson and giving you some of the parts where I do agree with him and have some sympathies with him, let me play you a part of Brenda Crossman, because I'd already arrived at these kinds of conclusions with my naive understanding of how Canadian law would work based on how law works in the UK. And she said the kind of things that I was already surmising. So let me play you a clip of Brenda Crossman. It's about 2.5 minutes long, I'm afraid, but have a listen to this.
Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to provisions in the criminal code that define an identifiable group for the purposes of advocating genocide, the public incitement of hatred, and the willful promotion of hatred. So how might these provisions affect the use of pronouns? And do these provisions in any way criminalize the use or misuse of pronouns? Not even close. First, it is absolutely not advocating genocide. Now, unless one wants to start talking about we should kill all the X's, then that's advocating genocide. But pronoun use, nowhere close. Public incitement of hatred. Well, the provisions of the criminal code requires that the incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. Now, does that sound subjective? Well, the Supreme Court of Canada has said there's a very clear definition. The threshold is violence. In fact, there has to be personal violence. It is an extremely high threshold. And again, the misuse of pronouns doesn't come anywhere close. Finally, the willful promotion of hatred, so-called hate speech provisions. Now, hate speech provisions in the criminal code have a very, very high threshold. The Supreme Court of Canada has repeatedly defined hate speech as only including the most extreme forms of speech. The court has said over and over again, and I quote, it is, quote, the unusually strong and deep felt emotions of vilification and detestation. The court has said it is not disdain, it is not dislike, it is not offense. Plus, something that's often lost, hate speech criminal charges cannot be laid without the approval of the Attorney General. So this is a high threshold. They are very difficult charges to bring. Third, Bill C-16 adds gender identity and expression to the provisions of the criminal code that deal with sentencing for hate crimes. Now here, under this particular section, 718(2)(a)(1), we tend to be concerned about numbers. Evidence that an offense is motivated by bias, prejudice, or hatred can be taken into account in sentencing. We already take a range of things into account: race, national and ethnic origin, religion, sex, age, and others. So now, evidence of hatred on the basis of gender identity and expression could be taken into account. It's important to emphasize, Section 718 does not create any new offenses. It simply means that any existing offense in the criminal code, like assault or sexual assault or murder, if it's motivated by hatred, could be given an increased sentence. This has no impact on pronouns, unless, of course, an accused was misusing pronouns while assaulting, sexually assaulting, or murdering someone. In other words, there's nothing in Bill C-16 that comes close to criminalizing the misuse of pronouns. Nothing. Not hate speech, not hate crime.
Okay, so I have to say a few things to say with regard to that. The first that I'll say is perhaps that the fact that I'm taking, because from my perspective, and on the camp that I kind of side with most of the time, Brenda Crossman, I suppose, would be the enemy. And yet, I kind of side with Brenda Cross's interpretation, or Brenda Crossman's, I should say, interpretation of this rather than Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson talks about the way that tribunals could interpret these kind of things, but it seemed to me that his beef was really with the tribunals and the way that the tribunals function. And that may be an issue. I don't know about that. There are so many different layers of this that I thought there's no point me trying to explore all of this and explore the dimension of the Ontario Human Rights Act and explore the dimension of specifically what the University of Toronto is demanding or suggesting for its faculty staff. Or how these tribunals function, but it seemed to me that with regard to Bill C-16 that Jordan Peterson's beef was more with the tribunals generally, and the complaints that he made with regards to this could easily function with regard to all these other things which already formed part of the Canadian Human Rights Act, and weren't specific to the fact that this business of gender identity or expression was included. So with respect to this point, I didn't really side with Jordan Peterson, and I got the impression that perhaps whilst I agree with some of his general positions and some of his concerns, that it felt to me as if he was overplaying his hand with regard to this. I felt as if he was sort of overreacting to this particular issue. That was my take on it. That is my take on it. Now, I need to put a little bit of a rider with regard to this, because just if we all just set ourselves apart from Jordan Peterson's views on this, right? Let's just set ourselves apart from Jordan Peterson's views, regardless of whether you agree with him or not. But just accept the fact that Jordan Peterson has his views and he has his concerns with regard to what he sees as this authoritarian and perhaps anti-free speech, anti-debate side to some strands of left-wing thinking. Right? Just accept that he has those things. And that at some point or other, he's going to want to get that out there, right? And to make his objections. And why wouldn't he? So my complaint there is that he's overplayed his hand, that maybe he could have found something better, a better target, right, to be his kind of cause célèbre for what he's driving on with here. Because if you listen to his full 10-minute opening, it's much more general. He says sometimes these things start from small issues, but actually the real issue is much bigger. And he talks about this in people's private relationships, marriages, and he says you might start arguing about doing the dishes, but soon it descends into a discussion where people are getting all sorts of things off their chest. Now, I kind of take on board what he says there. So I want to temper my criticism, which is this, is that it seems on face value that he's overreacting to this. But I accept that sometimes change, societal change, or the ways in which power is held in society or debates are shaped or stifled and free speech can be curtailed, don't always happen in saltations, in great leaps and jumps, but they happen in a much more gradualistic sense. And that doesn't mean they happen over decades or long periods of time. It could be that each one of those incremental steps happens in a short period of time, but nevertheless it happens in very incremental steps. And effectively, whichever step that you ended up making your broader challenge in relation to, some smug twat like me could stand there and say, you're actually over-portraying, you're overplaying this issue, right? You're over-responding to that. So I'm kind of sensitive to that, because it could be that actually there's no single step that Jordan Peterson could respond to where he wouldn't be effectively overplaying that issue. But if he was therefore to respond to none of those issues, he'd be drastically underplaying what to him is a very big issue. So I'm kind of sensitive to that. So I'd like to tackle those two things separately and to try and draw aside the fact that I don't see this Bill C-16 as instructing him as to what gender pronouns he has to use and demanding that he observes the gender pronouns that people wish him to use and ask him to use. I want to set that to one side and look at his other concerns separately. And I absolutely do agree with some of his concerns. So let me play you a clip of Jordan Peterson, and then we'll have a few things to say about what he has to say.
There's some things to talk about here, and I started to try to talk about them, and I would say that my freedom to do so was rapidly infringed upon. My career was put at risk, and I find this absolutely unacceptable because I am trying to sort this out. And believe me, you know what you call people you can't talk to? Enemies. And if we want to divide our society into armed camps of enmity, all we have to do is keep doing what we're doing. And I would recommend that we don't do this. I've studied authoritarianism for a very long time. I know what happens when things get out of control, and it can happen extraordinarily rapidly. And I would say we're on the cusp of that. And so we need to start talking and listening. And when you talk, it doesn't mean you're right. It doesn't mean you're correct, right? It means you're trying to articulate and formulate your thoughts like the boneheaded moron that you are. And you're going to stumble around idiotically because what the hell do you know? You're full of biases and you're ignorant and you can't speak very well and you're over-emotional. And you know, you've got just problems that you can hardly even imagine that are interfering with your ability to state something clear. And so what you do is you do your best to say what you mean, and then you listen to other people tell you why you're a blithering idiot, and hopefully you can correct yourself to some degree as a consequence of listening to them. And you see, that's what free speech is about, because you have to, it isn't just that people can organize themselves and their societies by thinking. You can't do that because there's only one of you. What you have to do is you have to articulate your thoughts in a public forum so that other people can attack you, and hopefully in a corrective manner. And then you want to step back a little bit and think, okay, well, I was a little arrogant there, and I was a little over emotional there, and I didn't get that quite right, and maybe I'm outright biased on that front. And you want to correct what you say, because then you correct how you are, and then you correct how you act in life, and then you correct your society. And to the degree that we limit freedom of expression, we put all of that at risk.
Okay, I mean, a lot to be said for what Jordan Peterson says there. Much more general. This is where he's supposed to be talking about Bill C-16, but actually he's talking about a much wider sphere, right? So you could criticise him for that, but nevertheless, the concerns he espouses there are concerns that a great number of people that I've spoken to have expressed. People as diverse as the very, very pro-social justice Kate Brooks, through to somebody like Haydar Zaki, who's involved in the Quilliam Foundation and the Right to Debate movement there within UK universities, that want to see these kinds of debates taking place, because his big beef, of course, Haydar Zaki and the Quilliam Foundation is with Islamic extremism and in tackling Islamic extremism, but they do not believe that stifling that, right, with just pushing it underground is the way to deal with it. Now, the way to deal with it is bringing it out in the open so that these things can be debated. And that is exactly the point that Jordan Peterson is making here. He's saying that he might not be right. He might be full of shit. His opponents might not be right. They might be full of shit. But the way to deal with that is to be able to talk about these things. And when we provide all these different mechanisms, whether in terms of legislation or whether it's in terms of public pressure or peer pressure to try and stifle these debates, we do not do anybody any good, and we certainly don't do the search for the truth any good. I absolutely agree with him there. And although I might have agreed with Brenda Crossman on the point that she made with regards to gender pronouns and Bill C-16, this was what she had to say right at the start of her 10-minute slot.
I'd like to start by saying that I'm delighted to be here today, except that I'm not. And I'd like to start by saying how much I support and respect all those faculty, staff, and students who are boycotting today's event. I think that that is also a very important form of speech.
To me, that comes across as somewhat worrisome. And then she said her bit after Jordan Peterson had said his. And yet what is more indicative of the kind of mindset that she'd rather she didn't have to have this kind of debate. And she debated, she applauded people, other members of faculty who decided to boycott this, who presumably rather these, even though these issues are clearly festering away like some kind of cancer, even though these are issues that clearly a lot of people have real problems with, they would rather these kinds of debates never took place, presumably because they feel that they have momentum on their side and they can now steamroller through their positions without ever having to discuss them in these kinds of forums. I don't find that a very good attitude, and I find that worrisome in the same way that Jordan Peterson does, I think. And that's aside from the issues themselves, and that's aside from what sides we take on any of these things. I want to play you another little clip from the second 10-minute slot that Jordan Peterson gives, which is something that I then want to reflect upon.
So I'm going to read you something that a graduate student sent me from the University of Toronto the other day, and I can also tell you that I've received hundreds of letters like this. Today, I had a tutorial at the University of Toronto where I talked about Jordan Peterson and issues of personal identity, legally sanctioned identity categories, etc. I brought up a video of a tall white man in his 30s who asked students at a university how they'd react if he told them he identified as a woman, as black, as short, and as 5 years old. Spoiler alert. Students in the video resist some of the later categories a bit, but are mostly accepting. Still, students were not engaging in discussion. I asked them why. One said it was because she was worried to share her opinion for fear of being singled out or saying something offensive. I asked who else was not speaking for that reason. The whole class put their hands up. That was shocking to me. I encouraged them to speak despite their worries, and they gave me some good feedback on how to make it easier for them to do so. For instance, by working in pairs and being assigned an opinion so that they didn't have to be responsible for it, or feel bad for defending it. No participation. Why? They weren't uninterested. They were afraid to speak their minds.
What did you think about that when you saw that? I found this the most thought-provoking part of the whole debate in a way, even though it perhaps wasn't one of the most central parts of this particular debate. I found it really, really thought-provoking. What Jordan Peterson is talking about is students, and he's portraying a group of students who don't feel enabled to talk about these issues in an academic setting. In an academic setting, they feel that they have got to suppress the way that they feel about these things, that it would not be appropriate, that it would not be the right thing, that in some ways they don't feel enabled anymore to give their opinions and their ideas, and that it's probably best if they just suppress how they feel and not engage in this kind of a discussion. And what I would have liked would have been to have listened to that, to have been able to see that, and to be able to look back at the screen and say, Professor Jordan Peterson, I think you're talking an absolute load of shit there, that I cannot believe that this is going on. I just think that you're making this story up. Now, of course, Jordan Peterson doesn't evidence it on this. He can't in this kind of format. So he could be making this story up. But I put it to you, and it doesn't matter what side of these discussions that you're on, do you feel that you could look at the screen and watch that and say with any confidence that Professor Jordan Peterson is making that up? Or do you look at it the same way as I did and you see the truth in this? That you see the same thing that I see, which is that you recognise what is being talked about here, that you recognise the way in which people feel suppressed, the way people feel disinclined to engage on these issues. They're not even willing to debate them when they're being asked to debate them in case they say the wrong thing, right? And how can that be healthy? However much you disagree with Jordan Peterson's position, how can it be healthy when people, even in an academic environment, are being made to feel like that? And after all, even if you think that maybe this didn't take place, unless you're prepared to say that, no, this couldn't have taken place, I don't buy that this kind of thing could have happened, then surely you can't deny this example, right? And you can't deny the concerns that go along with this kind of example. And that to me is a genuine concern. When we're having that kind of suppression, not just in a public political environment, but in a university environment, an academic environment where fucking hell you ought to be able to discuss anything, right? I think that is a serious, serious cause for concern. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say with regard to that. What I wanted to do in the end of this video, because it is about gender pronouns and gender identity, and I was asked what do I think about these particular issues. So what I wanted to do is to spend the last part of the video giving you my position with regard to this, and to give you my position with regard to this rabbit warren that we appear to be disappearing down, where, in my view, this whole thing is spiraling quickly out of control, and we need to get some kind of a grip on it. So what I want to do is I formulated my thoughts in terms of a kind of what is needed 3-point plan. Now, who am I, ignorant wanker that I am, to give a 3-point plan? So take it for what it is. It's just my way of putting my thoughts down. And the first point, because these points all follow, point 2 follows from point 1, point 3 from point 2. The first point is a recognition that people make shit up, and that certain types of shit are more easy to make up than other kinds of shit. I think maybe as a sort of entry point to that, let me give you a little example of something that used to happen in the fire service when I joined. When I joined, to get a full pension, you needed to do 30 years. But if you did 26.5 years, 3.5 years short, you could get a full pension. You could have what was called an ill health pension, right? If there was something physically wrong with you which stopped you doing your job, which was in some way perhaps related to your employment, then you could get your pension bumped up by those 3.5 years. So you'd only have done 26.5 years, but you'd get the same final salary pension as if you'd done a full 30 years. Now, what was interesting with regard to that was the amount of people who retired on ill health after 26 and a half years with regards to a bad back. Right? It wasn't, they didn't claim that they lost a leg or that, you know, they were getting mental issues or something like that. It was a bad back. And one of the reasons that people went for a bad back wasn't because they didn't have a bad back. I'm absolutely certain that some people did have a bad back. But the reason so many people went for a bad back is because, as many of you will know, it's quite a difficult thing to falsify. If you say you're getting terrible back pain, right, tests can be done and they may all draw a blank, but it's very difficult for somebody to outright say, no, this person is totally making this up. There is absolutely nothing wrong with their back and they are not experiencing excruciating back pain. Right, so that's why the bad back thing was so popular. It wasn't that it's impossible to have a bad back. It's that it's the perfect, it's just the easiest one to falsify. It's the easiest one to be full of shit over. And people did have reasons to be full of shit over it. In this case, their pension being uprated. Now, this is the difference that I find with regard to gender identity and gender expression over these other things, over sexual orientation, race, racial identity, all these other things that can be discriminated against, that it's being set alongside, is that it's very difficult to say, no, that isn't your gender identity, you're full of shit with regard to that. We're just to take you at face value. And what is clear is that when you take people at face value, they are full of shit. Now, that's not everybody who says that they've got one of these less regular gender identities is full of shit. Of course I believe that transgender people exist, that some people are physically male, right? But because I believe there is an innate and intrinsic component to our psyche, right, I do believe that somebody can be typically female-brained in a male body or can be typically male-brained in a female body. And I also accept that there will be some people who are non-binary, that if you ask them, well, do you feel male or female? Do you feel like a man or a woman? They honestly and genuinely would not be able to categorize themselves. I accept that. I think it's a very, very small number of people, but I accept that exists, right? But that does not falsify the fact that people will be full of shit. And that is the concern that I have here. And if people are prepared to declare themselves dragonkin and elfkin and all these other things where we know that they are full of shit, because we are aware that they cannot be 50% fucking dragon because there's no such thing as dragons, right? If people will be full of shit over those kind of identities, then how can we say that people will not be full of shit over gender identities? And yet gender identities are getting out of control. Let me read you from a document from the New York City Commission on Human Rights, if I may. In New York City, it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of gender identity and gender expression in the workplace, in public spaces and in housing. It goes on to say, this means individuals have the right to, and amongst those, be addressed with their preferred pronouns and name without being required to show proof of gender. So there is a real tangible way in which this is going to relate to everybody here, because you are expected in New York City, we're in the United States now, not Canada, but this is the example that I'm giving. You are expected to refer to people by their preferred pronouns once you know it, dependent upon their gender identities. And they helpfully give a list of gender identities that are recognized by New York City State. Here they are: bigendered, cross-dresser, drag king, drag queen, femme queen, female to male, FTM, which sounds suspiciously similar to female to male to me, gender bender, gender queer, male to female, MTF, non-op, hijra, pangender, transsexual, transperson, woman, man, butch, two-spirit, trans, agender, third sex, gender fluid, non-binary gender, androgyne, gender gifted, gender blender, femme, person of transgender experience and androgynous. Now, The number of gender identities doesn't obviously have to be the same as the number of groups of gender pronouns, but in actual fact, the number of groups of gender pronouns, it gets worse. There's 31 gender identities, but even within one gender identity, you could have multiple groups of gender pronouns. After all, out of those gender identities, I regard myself as a man. But it's entirely within my rights to say, well, I regard myself as a man, but I don't wish you to use the pronouns him, he, and his. I want you to use the pronouns and wibble. Right? And I can do that, can't I? Why can't I? It doesn't say anywhere there is going to be one assigned set of gender pronouns for each gender identity. So I'm sure that you can see the problem here. And couple that with the fact that young people, young adults I'm talking about here, there's a kind of tension that exists within young adults. I'm sure we all recognise that tension within young adults, which is that in part they want to fit in, don't they? They want to be part of the group, they want to fit into society and fit in with their peer group, but they also want to be unique. Right, by the time you get to my age, you realise that you're not, and you're just a normal, boring bastard, the same as your dad was a boring bastard, right? But at that age, you want to be unique, you want to be different, you want to find something that differentiates you from everybody else, and that's why you have these dragonkins, that's why you have these elfkins, and I propose that is why New York City has bent over, I'm afraid, and accepted 31 gender identities, even though when you look at this list, it's quite clear that there's no need for 31, and that doesn't depend on some kind of gender exclusivity where we only accept man and woman, or where we're only saying male and female identities have one gender identity tied to them and there's no spectrum and it's all a load of bullshit. There cannot be any need for 31 gender identities, can there? We're digging ourselves a fucking hole here. So that brings me on to point 2. And point 2 is, as a result of all of this, I think I propose that what we need is a little bit of fucking taxonomy going on here. Right, some of these academics need to start stepping up to the fucking plate in this field, getting their heads together and saying we need to start, rather than encouraging these terms to multiply like fucking rabbits, right, where the foxes, when we've killed all the foxes, what we need to do is we need to start employing a little bit of taxonomy here. Biologists wouldn't allow this shit, right? What they say is if there's more than one name for a species, you can have as many colloquial names as you like, right? But we're going to have one technical name, one scientific name, one name that we're actually going to pay any regard to. And I think we need a little bit of gender identity taxonomy going there, so that we get it down to a more reasonable group of 3, 4, 5 identities here that we can work with. There cannot be any need for 31 gender identities. On Facebook, they're allowing you 58 fucking gender identities. That isn't a workable way of doing things. Okay, especially not. You can call yourself whatever shit that you like. If you want to call yourself a Dragon King, you can do it. But if you're going to start saying on point of law that I have to respect that and then use a certain set of pronouns on the back of that, okay, then that's a little bit of a different situation, and then people need to start stepping up to the plate. Clearly, New York City Commission on Human Rights either don't have the skills or don't have the backbone to do it themselves, and I think that somebody in the academic community in these fields needs to do that, and we need to get some kind of consensus with regard to that. Point 3, either on that back of that taxonomy or in lieu of that taxonomy, for me a reasonable midpoint with regard to this is to accept that for a few people, right, gender neutrality is going to be something that they can reasonably identify with, because for them they can't really gauge, right? For them, being a man is as meaningful, identifying as a man is as meaningful as identifying for a woman, and I don't see any harm in taking that on board if they feel better for that, and it doesn't involve a great deal of effort on the parts of everybody else. Now, it is unfortunate that in English we don't have a set of gender neutral singular pronouns, but we do have they, their, and them. And I don't see that as anything other than a realistic compromise position, and the compromise position that nobody should have an issue with. So if somebody doesn't want to identify as a man and doesn't want to identify as a woman, and they want you to use the terms zim and brr, wibbly bob, right, then by all means tell them to stick it, that you're not going to remember a set of individual unique gender pronouns for them, but do be prepared to use they, their, and them. I think that's a reasonable point. Jordan Peterson makes a point that you're conceding the point when you do this. I don't agree with that there. I think he's flat out false there. For a long period of time, we've included in the United Kingdom legislation that has stopped you discriminating on the grounds of race. And none of that has stopped us. More and more people claiming as time goes on that there is no basis for race, and that it's just a phantasm of the fucking mind there, right? So if that has happened, and I don't care what you think about that argument, the fact is that that argument has been made more and more, despite of the fact that we have racial equality legislation. So in actual fact, I don't see that any of this legislation, or him using the terms they, them, and their, is in any way going to stop us having these conversations, right? So that would be my 3-point plan. First point, accept that this is getting out of control, and the nature of people is that they will make it worse and worse and worse. 2, we need to apply some taxonomic pruning to get a little bit of common sense with regard to this. And 3, the only expectation that you can have for other people is, if we're going to go beyond he, she, it's to go to they. I don't think you can reasonably expect anybody to go any further than that. If they want to, out of the goodness of their hearts, because you're their better mate and they're going to go that extra mile for you, then that's absolutely fucking fantastic. But I don't think you can expect any more out of that context. Right, I think I've got everything that I wanted to fit into this video. Sorry if it was a little bit waffly. I hope that's answered everybody's questions. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.